Thank you, Ray. I'm excited to talk to you today about my favorite topic, visual design for research. And if you're listening, you'll likely agree that visualization is an important topic to learn more about as we engage in the business of insights. I'm sure most of you have heard of the field of behavioral economics, which emphasizes that people aren't rational. We judge on all kinds of criteria that often make little logical sense. As our brains receive visual information, such as market research reporting or proposals, we're constantly making judgments whether we realize it or not. Also, people, and not just consumers, increasingly prefer information in smaller and more visual chunks. Thus, for this and many other reasons, it's critical that we adapt our insight communication, because if not, our hard work crafting insights could be ignored or, worse yet, misinterpreted. PowerPoint is a very powerful visualization tool. And while many people know how to use the functionality within it, unfortunately, effective use of it is less prominent, especially in our industry. Most of us were given a brief intro to PowerPoint and thrown into the business of market research. Years later, we're sort of on autopilot, not doing much to update our skills and relying on the defaults or trusting that PowerPoint will lead us to a good visual design. But I think that with an understanding of some key principles of design, we can stop the hours of tinkering with formatting and get to more effective visual stories that help us to, in our insights, really stand out and get cut through. The objective of information design is to provide visual clarity. Without visual clarity, the reader's eyes tire and their brains become naturally distracted, which isn't a good thing when you're sharing insights. We can achieve visual clarity through the use of basic principles of design by creating a visual tone, visual elements, and visual hierarchy. The visual tone is the colors, the fonts, and the imagery throughout an entire document or design. The goal with the visual tone is to tell a visual story that is cohesive. The visual elements are all of the items on the page: photos, icons, charts, tables. All of these items should together follow the visual tone. Visual hierarchy is how we use the visual elements to tell our story on each page. It tells the audience's eye what to focus on first, second, etc. It shows them what is most important and what is less important. Without visual hierarchy, the reader is going to eventually tune out and potentially they can become confused or frustrated. So, ironically, the ways to do this are crap. Uh, you can create a visual hierarchy by using the contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. All of these principles are already in play on our slides, but we're often not using them properly or to our advantage. Contrast shouts for attention, so we must use it wisely. Our eyes are naturally going to always focus on things that stand out or different, whether they be auditory or visual. That's just sort of how as human beings, how we work. Size is a way that we can add contrast, and often it's an underutilized element in the design of insights communications, but it can be incredibly powerful. Color is another way that we can add contrast, as well as position, orientation. Now, repetition is a way to remove contrast. We basically make navigation easier by repeating certain elements to create a theme or unity. It's really, really helpful to the eye to not have to worry about things that are contrasting for reasons that aren't really important. So you can have repetition of things like size, shape, color, or angle. Now, alignment is very powerful as well. It instills order and it's removing contrast from things that are unaligned. Aligned things look credible, orderly, professional, and easy to read. Whereas unaligned, they look chaotic, cluttered, and they immediately cause the eye to bounce around and it will get fatigued. Proximity is how you show visual relatedness. It's very interesting that, often with charts and different things, we'll color code them or use shapes to identify things that go together, when actually having things close together is a much better way for our brains to process that something goes together. So it can be very helpful to make sure that our bars within a chart and different things actually, and our legends and different things are very close to the data, because then we understand that things go together. Now, color is incredibly important for insight communication, but it's not something I can cover in our brief brief time here together today. So we're on to typography. Now, text is makes up a lot of what we communicate with our business partners and clients. And it actually is design is more important than type when you're very text heavy, which sort of, you wouldn't think about that, but it actually can be really, really powerful. And good typography or text use it will grab attention, it will enhance understanding, it'll create harmony, and will help with that creating that visual hierarchy that our reader audience is always looking for. But the key with typography is contrast. It's essential. You absolutely want contrast to establish visual hierarchy with type. And you can do that by different fonts and different treatments. But what you don't want to do is ever combine two similar things to create contrast. Combining Arial and Calibri is never a good idea. It sort of just looks like you mashed together two decks into one, and we're sort of sloppy. The whole point of having different fonts really is contrast. So you can combine, script fonts with regular fonts, tall with short, thick with thin, or serif with sans. And by serif, I mean, they have those little what's called serifs on the end of the different of the each little letter. But you definitely want to make sure that you avoid sort of the cliche or cutesy fonts like these. Unless you're a kindergarten teacher, no one should be using Comic Sans or any of these other ones. They're just not professional for business. Speaking of things you should avoid, unless you're still using sort of the floppy disks that go on your computer, you should have also avoid these bullet points that are from about the same time as those floppy disks. These bullets are very decorative. They basically say, "Hey, look at me." When with a bullet, that's not really the objective. You want to be highlighting the information, not the bullet itself. So make sure your bullets are subtle. They shouldn't be a visual focal point. And they definitely, they're very distracting if they are, such as those different funny shapes. So I like to do grays or subtle dashes or a subtle circle. And quite frankly, most of the time you don't need a bullet. PowerPoint and Word, they've got us in this really bad habit of using bullets for so much, when in reality, if we just have the right amount of spacing between lines, which is pretty typical, the normal amount, we don't need them. They're just visual noise that doesn't need to be on the page. I personally only use bullets every couple months. It's very rare that I feel that a design needs a bullet. Now, visual hierarchy is, a really great topic that I could spend, quite frankly, days on. But I think it's somewhere where we really need to concentrate more on a slide to slide basis. So, because basically on our slides today, it seems like everything is standing out. We need to take a lot of be very choiceful in what should be standing out to the eye. Because if everything stands out, really nothing is stand out. What we need to do is make sure that the important things stand out. What is the meaning of the data for that slide? Why is this slide even in the deck? And then anything else, whether it be, supplemental text, sources, all of that should really recede as far as possible. Now, and it's also critical for visual hierarchy that we have white space. White space really should be your best friend when you're designing stuff. I know we like to cram everything on there to fit it to one page or whatever, but to really have a good communication of some insights, we need some white space. And it doesn't have to be white though. The negative space allows the reader's eye to rest, and it greatly helps readability. When print first started, white space was lost money. And today still, people think cluttered slides look smart, but that's not the case. They just look, well, cluttered. Don't think about it as empty space. Consider it like an important element of every slide. Give that eye a little bit of rest to let the truly important things stand out. You think about something that could be luxurious white space and it lets the branding or whatever it may be stand out. Think about a company like Apple. I mean, their packaging, everything they do is very beautiful. And it's because they basically silence all that visual noise that doesn't need to be there. Now, speaking of stuff that doesn't need to be there and is pretty noisy, this is a pretty typical slide that I don't know about you, but I see this slide a lot. Nobody really wants to read the slide. I don't know about you, but it's overwhelming to my eye. I don't want to read it because first off, there's no real visual hierarchy. Everything's sort of jumping out to me at the same time. There's a little white space, and these lines of text are so long. It's almost as if I have to, just crane my neck from left to right to be able to read them. A good recommendation is always to make sure you have really big differences in size for your headers and your supplemental text, as well as don't have these really long all the way across the page text lines. We really should always go for no more than 50 to 60 characters maximum per line. There's a reason that when you see magazines and newspapers that things are put into columns. It's a much better, much more easily read text that way. So here's an example of we took this exact text, cut it into two slides, and here's a way to show this exact information. Well, boom. Doesn't this look so much better? I actually want to read it. And, I also, people don't typically read, they scan. So with the previous slide, I probably was only not going to get much out of it. But even if I just spend 3 seconds on this slide, I know the three things that are important. And I know, I really feel like it's much more inviting to read. And this is a slide format that anybody can do, no matter what their design skills. So don't be reluctant to play with size, whether that be in typography or text, whatever it may be, to really play up size. And I'm not talking about differences of, oh, this is 14-point font. I'm going to make this other one, 20-point font. No, consider going really, really big if something is really, really important. You can also use color. Color is a great way to have stuff pop out, but it should be the stuff that matters, not just random things. And keep it simple. A lot of text, we put way too many signals to try to grab people's attention. We're bolding, we're italics, we're underlining, and we're doing color. And all it really looks like is very noisy. It's not inviting, and the real message gets lost. You're much better to pick one, possibly two signals to have something stand out. And I absolutely always avoid underline and italic. Underline makes your eye look at the line, not the word that actually is being underlined. Be much better to go with bolding. And in terms of italic, it's very rarely needed and it's harder to read. It stands out for reasons that really aren't the best. I mean, it's one thing if you're doing a quote, but in general, you'd be better just to put quotes around something than use it underline. But whatever you do, just pick one or two symbols, signal types for making something stand out, and then be consistent. You also want to make sure that you're only showing the information that is truly relevant. As I said earlier, most people are scanning, they're not reading. So, what I always recommend is to go through what you have, cut it down considerably, get rid of any words that are not necessary, figure out if something really should be split into multiple pages or slides. And then once you do that, cut it down again and think about those really short attention spans that people have and the little amount of time they're going to have to actually review something because you want that attention seeker to pop out. If that's not obvious the minute you look at that slide, you need to rework the slide to make sure it is popping because for the insight to shine, everything else that's secondary has to go to the background. Now, beveling, reflecting, shadow, and soft edges. All of those little extra bells and whistles that Microsoft has added, what are under like shape effects, are very entertaining, but they're not good helpers for communicating business and research insights because they're decorative. Our eyes don't go to the thing that it's trying, that's in the shape or the text spots, etc. It goes to this treatment that you gave it. So I always tell people, don't ever touch the shape effects button unless you're turning off shape effects that someone else had put in there. They're decorative. They're definitely not an effective use in any market research or insights reporting. Another decorative treatment to avoid are these sort of, look at me shapes. They came out with PowerPoint a long time ago, and they're just too much. You can get people's attention on your slide without using these sort of cutesy shapes. I like to think of the left one as sort of the car wash or the dry cleaner sales sign that you'll see in the window. Definitely not a good use for insights and data reporting. Obviously, tables and charts are a big portion of what we do. So let me give you a couple tips and tricks when dealing with them in terms of their visual design. Only use what is relevant to the insight and your audience. They can easily get lost in the sea of data that we serve up in market research. So the key is to reduce distraction, and that could be grid lines, unnecessary decimal point, axes, and then gaps between bars, etc. And you want to make sure that your priority is on highlighting meaning and understanding of the data. So the labels are obvious and clear, the numbers are big enough to see, and most importantly, the key insight can be found immediately by looking at the data. So what you have to do then, unfortunately, is avoid many of the defaults within Microsoft PowerPoint and Microsoft Excel. Oftentimes the tables and different things that we put together are focused more on the formatting and not the data itself. Here's a pretty typical example of a big ugly data table that we have. And unfortunately, the first thing my eye is going to is the formatting, and the last thing it's going to is the data itself. They sort of overdid it with this formatting. There's lots of colors, there's lines, there's shading, there's a lot going on, and I feel like it's overdone. There's a lot of distraction, whereas the insight or the data just really isn't hardly there. So you can pick, with a table, I'd recommend picking border lines or shading. You really don't need both. And you certainly don't need decoration and tons of color just for the sake of it. Get rid of only the most critical formatting for understanding, and then add contrast through size or color to highlight the really important insight. And definitely, try to be choiceful about what data you're showing. I feel like we show so much data that, there's no one has time to possibly consume or comprehend it all. And it's okay to leave some stuff out or put it in the appendix. Now, insight creators, unfortunately, we often trust that Microsoft knows how to effectively create charts, given that Microsoft creates more charts than probably any software out there ever. Well, unfortunately, they're not that great at it. The default charts and slide layouts are really sort of awful, quite frankly, especially for the amount of data that we have to communicate. So it's, slide after slide. So the grid lines are generally unnecessary. Decimal points and the axes aren't necessary. They're sort of just something else that the eye has to take in when they're typically not needed. And for this chart, for example, my eyes go right to these bright colors. The last thing I actually look at is the insight at the top. Now, if I actually play up the inside at the top and let the chart still, be an important focus, I get something like this. You know, not nearly as much color, still colorful, visually interesting, but I've got, a very clear story here about what is most important, what should I be looking at, and what the key insight is. Now, obviously, we don't have unlimited time to make every slide beautiful. We're under time pressure, no matter if you're on the client or the supplier side. So, my recommendation is to figure out within your document what are a few slides that you really need to make killer slides. So, whatever they may be, the executive summary, the wrap up, whatever those slides may be, and take those extra time to really play them up with icons or pictures, imagery, etc. For example, here's, wrapping up the key findings with a picture and some icons and, having it really nicely gel together. Or here we're using icons to create charts. Or another example here, taking icons, layering them, and then cropping one layer that's a slightly different color. But ultimately, what you need to be doing is make sure that any choices you're making in terms of formatting or layout have a purpose and you're not decorating. So if we stop decorating our data and our designs, I think we'll have much more effective insights reporting. Thank you.